Hello, this is Dr. Coates. It is March 26th, 326, and this is the first lecture for week 2 of Module 4. And this one is about the distinction between, if one exists, anthropomorphism, personification, and I've also tacked in something about apostrophe, which is related. So, here we go. As with last week's lectures, which started with a Tuesday talk that introduced some concepts, and then a Thursday talk which developed them further, I'm going to do the same thing this week. I'd like to spend today going over personification and its ilk, and then return on Thursday to talk about humanism, which I see as the greatest single driving influence and consequence of personification. Remember that even though your illustration for Module 4 will be about ekphrastic poetry, the stuff we talked about last week, this week and next week will both be on the exam. In next week's poem, combine personification and post-humanism, so they feed into one another. So this is another way of my saying that the Twitter conversations and the journal post for the end of this week will be of particular importance for you, since you won't have another chance to practice these concepts before the third exam. But here's a brief overview of how these 2 weeks look in relation to each other. This week we're reading poems that deal with poets projecting their thoughts and emotions onto animals, and thereby imaging what things would be like if they were animals instead of human beings. Next week we avoid the substitution altogether, so no animals, and read poems about imagining that you're not even alive anymore, projecting what the world would look like when the self simply stops, and afterward. Okay, in general, if you look up either term, anthropomorphism or personification, online, you'll be told that they are basically synonymous. Both terms have to do with an attempt to map human thoughts, characteristics, agency, motivations, or emotions onto inanimate or animate but inhuman objects, concepts, or animals. Earlier in literary history, we would have distinguished between a text that sustains this human to inhuman mapping for a longer duration, like one of Aesop's fables, The Ant and the Grasshopper. Maybe one that you remember. Remember the ant saves up for winter and the grasshopper doesn't, and the ant has all the food and the grasshopper has to come begging. Or maybe Richard Adams' Watership Down, which has bunnies as all the main characters. Or most every Disney or Pixar animated movie. Finding Nemo, for example, is my 3-year-old daughter's current favorite movie. It has a bunch of talking sea creatures. They are anthropomorphic, okay? Anthropomorphic, giving human qualities to animals. We would save personification for a relatively brief association of human characteristics with the inhuman, which will still be objects, concepts, or animals, right? The icy fingers of a chill wind, you might say, without giving the wind a name, Charlie, and making him not only male, but the main character of a narrative or something like that, right? You would just say it as a one-off in a sentence. And so a relatively brief instance of giving human qualities to the inhuman. I don't know if this is obvious, but one reason why literary instructors are moving away from the, I think, useful distinction between sustained anthropomorphic associations of human to inhuman and relatively brief personifications of some concepts is that anthropomorphism is not very gender inclusive. It literally means changed into a man, which isn't very nice to women, you know, who deserve to be thought about. And there's no such problem with personification, because changed into person is more inclusive. So anyway, I will accept either of these terms, even though I continue to use anthropomorphism. I'm sorry, I will accept personification as describing either the sustained version or the relatively brief one, but I'm going to continue to use anthropomorphic, you know, to talk about texts that have, as for example, Edward Lear's The Owl and the Pussycat, which has an owl and a pussycat character, and they both act as though they're human beings. I just feel like that's a useful distinction, but I do offer it with that caveat that it's not incredibly gender inclusive. Okay, now another term here, apostrophe. It's from the Greek for turning away. It's a rhetorical figure of speech by which the speaker of a poem stops and conspicuously addresses something, whether alive or dead, person or object or concept. In other words, it can, but doesn't have to, include personification. It can also just be, oh, Joe, standing over there, right? And Joe might be very much alive. It could also be, oh, love, who torments me, you know, with these feelings, and which would definitely be personification. But the point here is that there's an O, right? Apostrophes begin with O, usually, as Shelley does, Percy Shelley, at the beginning of Ode to the West Wind, which we read in Module 1. Quote, "O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being," and so on. Sometimes it doesn't, though. John Donne's Meditation for Whom the Bell Tolls, which we'll be reading next week, begins, "Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful," etc., which is both an apostrophe and personification. The point is that the speaker conspicuously addresses someone within the poem with like a comma after their name, which is simultaneously an attempt to create some sort of potentially adversarial dialogue, since the object of the apostrophe rarely answers back, and an opportunity to depict the act of apostrophe itself, since it's a self-conscious trope and therefore self-reflexive. I'm speaking to somebody, right? It is what you're basically saying when you say, oh, wild west wind, I will address the wind. But that's also a trope for what the speaker is already doing for the audience. I'm speaking to you, reader. Right? So that's why it's self-reflexive. Let me linger on the that sort of adversarial nature of apostrophe for a second, because apostrophe has long been seen as a rhetorical flourish designed to provoke sympathy for the speaker, an emotional appeal, and, at last, I can explain why John Ruskin called the act of personifying an inhuman landscape the pathetic fallacy, which I did in passing earlier in Module 2. It's not because he was being dismissive, which is our modern way of thinking about the word pathetic, as in, my father's attempt to dress himself this morning was both hideous and pathetic. Right? Like, I don't like what he did. But because Ruskin understood the impulse to personify the landscape, give it human qualities, especially huge panoramas, or the horizon, which resemble the sublime in all its terrifying yet beautiful majesty. You'll remember our conversations about the sublime from last module, which in the discipline of rhetoric is lumped together with other appeals to emotions. The appeal to the emotion rather than the appeal to logic or the appeal to ethos. It's what rhetoricians call pathos, following Aristotle, and that's where we get the pathetic fallacy from. Not that it's a bad idea to do this, but that you're trying to trigger emotions in the speaker when you personify the landscape. That's why it's called the pathetic fallacy, and hopefully that makes more sense now. Anyway, the poems that we're reading for this week are all poems that are about animals, and that's just for the sake of consistency. There are plenty of instances of personification that don't involve animals at all, and which contain personification of some degree or other. They are attempts by poets to either depict the encounter between a human being's subjectivity with an animal's, puzzling out what it must be like to be a snake or a sandpiper or a blackbird or a bird or a fish or an ostrich, or to actually inhabit that animal's anthropomorphized perspective and speak as an animal, as Elizabeth Bishop does in the poem Rainy Season Subtropics, which is a great poem, and it's a prose poem as well. You'll see a giant toad, or you'll hear a giant toad speaking to you if you read that poem, as well as a crab. It's good. And I just want to leave you with a few options for what the motivation might be to depict animals with human qualities. And if you're reading the transcript of this, you'll see that this is a bulleted list. 1. To use animals as a convenient foil for questioning or exploring human motivations. This is certainly Aesop's motive in most of the fables, and fables in general are about teaching children moral lessons, so that makes sense. In this case, you defer the human problem to animals, who are often cartoonish or absurd, to illustrate a point that might strike too close to home if the narrative had human characters instead. Okay? A second motivation might be to illustrate the limits of human comprehension or understanding. Most of our speakers for this week are trying, but often failing, to understand the vital differences between animals and human beings. Coming to grips with what can't be known is another way of pointing toward what can't be put into language, right? And constitutes a worthy challenge for the poet. And then 3, and this is related to number 2, to imagine what life looks like when we are someone else. For personified poems like these, even though the poets are projecting themselves into animals, they're still animals with human characteristics. Maybe not souls, but still animals. Animals as imagined by a human being. So it may be the end of the self of the speaker that they're contemplating, but it's not the end of humanity. It's not like the end of being yourself. It's just what yourself would look like if it were projected into a crab or a toad, An easier task than the poems we read for next week, which is just the end of all things. Okay? So keep that in mind, that cheery thought. And I will be back on Thursday with extensions of these ideas. But first, before that, I'll be back on Wednesday with a Twitter prompt for you all to respond to. And yeah, I hope it's as good as last week's, which were wonderful. So anyway, cheerio, and I'll see you on Thursday.